Good morning. I'm Carol Thompson-Cole, President and CEO of VPP+Raise DC. Thank you for joining us for the third program of our 20th anniversary speaker series. And to thank you to our investors, board members, partners, friends, and guests who are joining us virtually. VPP+Raise DC creates connections and drives actions that improve life outcomes for youth 0 to 24 in Greater Washington. We approach systems change with a racial equity lens through cross-sector collaboration and direct investments focused on early childhood, boys and young men of color, and career and college readiness. Today's program will be about one of VPP+Raise DC's core areas, early childhood. We have deep experience investing in early childhood education and scaling successful and innovative solutions in the areas of professional development, workforce development, teacher preparation and curriculum, and performance management with Appletree, Centronia, Child and Family Network Centers, Heads Up, and Mary Center. VPP+Raise DC's Early Grades Change Network is focused on finding solutions that promote kindergarten readiness and third grade reading levels. This collective impact table, although currently focused on the District of Columbia, has demonstrated the capacity to identify and scale early childhood solutions in other jurisdictions with similar target populations. Our panelists will discuss early childhood workforce development challenges through a regional cross-sector lens. They will also address how each of their respective organizations is involved in this work. We are pleased to provide panel representation from a corporate perspective and a funding collaborative, a nonprofit, a foundation, and government. This comprehensive range of viewpoints will explore potential solutions to tackle systemic drivers of wealth gaps in early education collectively. It will also support how working cross-sector can affect systems change and elevate the early education profession in Greater Washington to be a career choice that promises competitive family-sustaining wages. I want to thank the leaders in our community joining us today who are dedicated to addressing the multifaceted aspects of early childhood workforce development in our region. The PNC Financial Services Group, Washington Area Women's Foundation, Martha's Table, Bainham Family Foundation, and Fairfax County Department of Family Services. Like VPP+Raise DC, these organizations recognize the value of cross-sector alignment and regional collaboration. By working together to align resources, our collective impact makes us stronger with a greater ability to improve education, healthcare, and career and college outcomes for our children and young adults, resulting in broader, deeper, and lasting systemic change. We are honored to have Wendy Goldberg moderate today's program. Wendy has been a dedicated advocate for children represented by her long-standing leadership with organizations addressing health, legal, and educational issues affecting vulnerable youth and families. She was a leader of Raise DC, part of the Strive Together network, and is now a board member of VPP+Raise DC and Mary Center, as well as board of Educator DC. And now I'd like to turn it over to Wendy.
Thank you, Carol. I'm so glad to be here today to moderate. So, as most of you know, disparities existed in both the quality of and access to early childhood education even before the pandemic began. There is just so much variability in the quality of early educational programming that makes some children not ready for kindergarten. Once they're behind in kindergarten, it's really hard to catch up, and they stay behind for their whole schooling career. If we want to ensure quality and equitable learning, we have to have well-trained and properly incentivized early childhood teachers. If we hope to address early childhood outcomes, we need to help prepare and support early childhood educators and support the ecosystem around them. In DC and frankly in the country, the early childhood workforce has been undervalued and underinvested for decades. The majority of early educators are women of color, and they earn an average of $17,771 a year. It's not just lack of pay, but lack of respect, because early education is not seen as a field requiring expertise, which is both a cause and effect of the gender, race, and class dynamics at play. Fortunately, we have 5 incredible panelists with us who are working across the region to respond to these needs in early childhood education. We're about to hear more about how they are working to address the challenges of the early childhood workforce development. So with that, let's begin the conversation with each panelist introducing themselves and how their work fits into the system of early care. Jermaine, let's start with you.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Wendy, so much for having me as a part of this panel. I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have here today. So at PNC, this is a topic and a platform that we've been involved with since 2004, going back to supporting our Grow Up Great program, which supports early childhood education for kids who are between the ages of 0 and 5. During that time, we have touched over 7 million children during that period, and we've recently hit 1 million hours of volunteerism for early childhood here in the Greater Washington market and across all of our markets across the country. So excited to be a part of this discussion. We understand that there's a lot of work to be done. I think we've all learned the importance. I want to say thank you to all the caregivers who are on this call today and for all the teachers. I think we've learned during this period how important those caregivers are for multiple reasons. And we certainly want to continue to support them as we move forward. Thank you, Wendy.
No, thank you. Martine?
Good morning. Hi, I'm with Washington Area Women's Foundation. We house an early care and education funders collaborative. This is a pooled funding model with multiple funders from across the region. We've been focused on investing in the well-being and advancement and support of the early care and education workforce for the last few years now. And happy to work with our partners on the ground, both early educator membership associations, community organizers, advocates, and others towards advancing the early care education workforce. And on average, our partners and our work alongside them reaches about 3,500 and helps to benefit 3,500 early educators across the region year over year, and close to 40,000 families with young children. So we're very excited to just be able to stand beside them. And I'm excited to be able to stand beside the panelists this morning.
Thank you. We'll move to Kim.
Good morning. My name is Kim R. Ford. I am the proud president and CEO of Martha's Table, where we support strong children, strong families, and strong communities here in the District of Columbia. We do have nationally accredited early childhood education centers supporting young people 6 weeks to age 4. If anybody is one of my social media friends, you'll see yesterday gave a young man, a 3-year-old, his first tie. He was so excited about it. He wore it all day. Mom told me she had to fight with him to get it off to eat, and he's decided to wear the tie today again. So I really want to thank VPP and Raise DC, Carol Thompson Cole, Taleka Brooks, Wendy Goldberg, good friend, all of my fellow panelists, the Martha's Table team, all of our ECE educators, and as Jermaine rightfully said, all of the caregivers that are out there, our families, our parents. Very excited about today.
Thank you. Thanks for being here and always being enthusiastic. Marika?
Good morning. My name is Marika Cox Mitchell, and I am Director of Early Learning at the Bainham Family Foundation. For more than 50 years, the Bainham Family Foundation has provided children with equitable educational opportunities and other supports needed for their lifelong success. Our work in early childhood deepened in 2015 And right now we currently focus on partly directly with early childhood programs in centers and homes like Martha's Table to support the effectiveness and well-being of the early childhood education workforce. We also work directly with policy advocates to ensure that the early childhood system meets the needs of young children, first and foremost, but their families as well as the workforce. And our advocates include workforce-led organizations. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least is Anne-Marie.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marie Tui, and I'm the director of Fairfax County's Office for Children, a part of Neighborhood and Community Services. And I'm also a very proud former Child Care Center director. The Office for Children is dedicated to the care, education, and healthy development of young children from birth through elementary school, really focusing on that first decade of a child's life. We partner with early childhood programs, families, community and county partners, Fairfax County Public Schools, to implement Fairfax County's Equitable School Readiness Strategic Plan, Birth to 8, which has a real focus on equity. Our work at the office includes administering childcare subsidies, early Head Start and Head Start grants, as well as providing direct services in partnership with public schools, family childcare providers, and nonprofits. We permit family childcare homes, and our food program sponsors provide school-age childcare in 141 locations, as well as provide early intervention services for babies and toddlers. And we also administer a number of grants and initiatives that support school readiness, including the state's pre-K program. And we provide professional learning opportunities and quality supports for early childhood educators. And we are really grateful to be working with VPP in partnership. They're providing thought partnership and strategic investments in our work in the county, in our commitment to advancing racial and social equity. And we look forward to that support as we make sure that we're having a positive impact on our most vulnerable children, youth, their families, and our economy.
Thank you so much. As you can hear, we have quite a diversity of perspectives, of sectors, and of the region. So why don't we just get started with the conversation? And through COVID-19, we've seen an exodus of women from the workforce. Many have left the workforce because of the need to care for their own families. How has this need for early childhood education and the perceived value of early child care and early child care workers changed post-pandemic, or do you think it has? I'll ask Kim to answer first.
Well, thanks so much, Wendy. I would say certainly the thoughts around value and respect, as you mentioned earlier, has certainly changed. It's evolved. So what have we seen on the ground? What we saw was that a number of center-based care centers went to virtual, which we did initially, but many also closed. And what we heard from our families and other families were the only way I can keep my job, the only way I can do what I need to do to keep the roof over my head is for me to actually be able to have my child or my children in center-based care. For those who may have spent some time or a long time at this point, 16, 17 months, for those who actually had to stay at home, whether it's ECE or school-age children, the value and the respect increased because people were like, okay, no, like this was not what I thought. Remember, being a parent is great, and parents as teachers, absolutely, right? But when you actually have to serve as the teacher all day long, and there is a very clear distinction about early childhood education. That's why it's credentialed, is because it's actually based on curriculum. There are actually lesson plans. There's development growth that's happening. It's not just that custodial care, that safety, daycare of you're just here. So when parents, really saw and realized, I actually have to teach my child. I actually have to keep them on track. I actually have to make sure they're on the literacy and numeracy, yes, from 6 weeks even up to age 4. So I would say that one of the unintended consequences of the pandemic has been that the value and respect for education, I think across the board, but certainly for early childhood education, has increased. And with the folks that closed, a lot aren't coming back. They're not. And so we continue to see this increase in demand and desire for center-based care because people are trying to get to work, they're trying to get back to work, and they can't do that if they have to be at home with little Johnny, who's 2, running all over the place all day, right? When I gotta, focus you, do play-based curriculum care. So I do think that, again, the value and the respect has increased, at least for the time being.
Great. Marika, from the more systems perspective, do you have a comment here?
Sure. I mean, I'll definitely say the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the visibility and public attention. From a historical perspective, I think it's important to acknowledge that most of the gains we've seen in early learning, be it Head Start, the Military Child Care Act, came from a public crisis. The closest we've gotten to universal quality childcare was the response to the World War II. So this idea of crisis, increasing public attention and driving systemic change is a pattern that we're seeing played out today. I think it provided an opportunity for all to see the state of childcare or early learning systems for what it is. It's an important component of our ecosystem. It drives the economy, supports child development, supports families, yet it is significantly underfunded and fractured. And the system as it's currently designed, some would even argue that we don't have a system, but the system as it's currently designed, it works well for no one. It's burdensome, particularly for women, and Black and Brown women in particular. And so this is just an opportunity for a wider audience to see what early childhood educators, what the advocates have been saying for decades, that we need a more sustainably funded, more effective and more equitable early learning system.
Thank you. And other comments on this before we move to the next question? Well, it's a kind of follow-up. So in following that, what role can greater investment in early childhood play in the post-pandemic recovery? I think maybe Jermaine has some perspective on that from the corporate side.
Yeah, so I think we came at the investment of early childhood. It started with the view that most of the investment was in the K-12 segment, and for us here at PNC, it was important for us to address a segment that had not been previously addressed going back to 2004 when we first got on this journey. And we actually had canvassed our employee base to get a sense from them as to what we thought would be impactful and meaningful for us to invest in. And again, this goes back to a much earlier period than the pandemic that we're currently dealing with today. And we recognized that, one, that the need was there. There was a segment that really wasn't being addressed. So we created a $500 million multi-year commitment to serve in this space. And I think what we've seen over time, to Marika's points, this was always an area that really needed to be addressed. And it's only been exacerbated by what we've seen here in the pandemic. And we've learned how important it is, for folks like me. I'm sitting here in my DC office today. Fortunately, my wife, we were blessed to be able to have a person to be at home to help with my kids. My kids are much older than what we would find within this segment. But in the underserved populations, especially for early childhood, that's a place where if we were not investing in this place, the underserved in particular fall behind significantly. 18 months on average would be behind in that category for the underserved across all the markets that we serve as PNC. And so the investment was important for us to try to close that gap. We recognize that if we provide early childhood education to folks who are in those underserved markets, that potentially we can increase the social mobility, the social and economic mobility for that category. It gets them on a path of learning much earlier in the process. And the challenges that we have with that population much later down the road is less. So for every dollar of investment that we make within the community and the underserved and for early childhood, it's $16 that we save in terms of the resources that we have to provide to that individual over time throughout the course of their life. And so that investment is important. That's the reason why we got involved many, many years ago. And I'm pleased to see us continue on that journey, both from an economic perspective and then also with the volunteerism that we provide as well.
Well, thank you. I think maybe Martine, you might have a perspective on how we invest in early childhood across the board in terms of workforce pay and how that affects the system as a whole.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I mean, to a lot of what's already been said, you know, the really hitting home the idea that for all of our societal complaints, perhaps, about the level of public and private investment in our sort of traditional K-12 education systems, which, you know, everything could stand to be improved. I won't debate that, but the investment is there in some way, and the systems exist in some way. And I think what we've seen and what a lot of the panelists have already touched on is that, you know, the systems for early education starting, you know, at birth 6 weeks, as they do at Martha's Table, yes, it's just not there in the same way. And so when we're talking about investments, we shouldn't just be looking at, even, you know, like myself, those of us who are working in philanthropy, we cannot just look at private investments. We cannot just look at corporate investments. We have to be talking about public investments as well, and how those can be braided together to a coordinated, intentional system that really support families and educators, and really support our communities. And as Marika said, you know, care work in general makes all other work happen, right? And when we're talking about early education, it's to Kim's point, it's not just care work, it's so much more, but our systems have not treated it as such. And so when we're talking about what role greater investment can have as part of a post-pandemic recovery, we really need to be thinking about, from our perspective here at the Women's Foundation, at the Early Care Education Funders Collaborative, for private investments, how private investments can support stakeholders on the ground, can support early educators, can support families in having their voices at those policy tables, so that government dollars, which is where the dollars are when you look at the sheer volume of a scale of the issue, you know, we cannot just, we cannot say that private dollars alone are going to fund this issue away, right? We have to be looking at public investment to some extent. And so where private dollars can be directed is really towards the capacity building support of those grassroots voices, the educators themselves, the families themselves, to be able to be at the table with decision makers, with policymakers in a new way. I mean, you know, we have a lot of systems for public voices to be heard. They are not always, unfortunately, accessible for the types of populations that are most vulnerable. Those opportunities could be strengthened, and you know, and that's to the benefit of both policymakers and government folks like our wonderful Anne Marie who's on the panel, to be able to have the opportunities to talk to the families and the educators who she and others want to hear from. And so we really need to think about how we can invest more strongly and intentionally in our current systems, but also how we can think differently about how money moves through systems. The early education funding streams are very diverse. They don't all have the same intention. They come from down from the feds to county and local and state jurisdictions in different ways through different agencies. There's a lot of coordination and systems, unfund systems redesign that probably need to happen. And so, that's a whole technical skill set that we could all talk about all day, but there really I think the first and foremost, we really need to be talking, coordinating across sector, across agency, and directly with those most impacted.
Just to try and understand, if we wanted to look at this funding issue regionally, right, each jurisdiction has its own funding stream. How do you think that might work if we really wanted to do this through the cross-sector or regional funding, so that we had more equity across the jurisdictions? Does anyone have a suggestion or an idea that they've seen or tried? Or I don't want to put you on the spot, Anne-Marie, but you are a government person.
Well, I think our early childhood workforce lives in different parts of the DMV and works in others. So I think when we talk about having a shared set of expectations around early childhood educator competencies, what those look like, and how we can link those competencies to compensation in a strategic way that is across the region. I'm not exactly sure how to get there, but I think that is a goal for us to have. I think the pandemic has really highlighted, among so many other things that have been articulated, but really what a truly dedicated and nimble and amazing early childhood workforce we have in this country. When we take a look at how they have remained on the front lines, dealing with children who were living through a crisis and meeting their social emotional needs while going through extraordinary lengths to keep them safe and healthy. If we can be committed to supporting educators on their professional learning path and making sure that our system of funding this infrastructure in the country really recognizes that the heart of this work are the people doing the work, and that we need to have a funding model that compensates people fairly for that. I think conversations such as this and cross-sector and cross-region conversations are important, and that really it's only coming together collectively to articulate and advocate together that we will make progress, I think, moving forward.
And I think along those lines, one concrete example could be creating some form of reciprocity for credentials. So sort of DMV policies around what qualifications are required for lead teachers or teacher assistant or center directors, so that the workforce can easily transit between sort of the DMV areas like we see in other professions, like nursing.
I think to also just highlight some work that actually Anne-Marie and Marika and others have been involved in with us at the Women's Foundation. We basically starting to allow for government, nonprofits, educators to come together across the region and have that space and opportunity and resources to have those discussions and conduct research across the region in regard to what the workforce looks like. And this is a lot of what the Early Care Education Funders Collaborative has been investing in over the last 5 years or so, and will continue to invest in. And some of the things that Anne-Marie and Marika just spoke about, there for other, as Marika mentioned, for other professions, there are drivers for those workforce development conversations to happen, right? Especially in what we deem as good jobs, high growth fields. You know, we have a federal funding to meet across the region. We have organizations that form to meet across the region and coordinate. Effectiveness aside, how long it might take aside, these are difficult conversations, but the impetus and the drive is there. What we're trying to do, and what, as has been said, what needs to happen with this field is that respect that we're seeing now, that drive that we're seeing now, to really fuel those conversations for folks like Anne-Marie to have conversations with other government leaders across the region to say, okay, where can we connect? There's a lot on everybody's plate. People aren't always, especially at the nonprofit level, they're not always resourced to be able to have the capacity to have those conversations across the region. So how can we, especially in the private sector or private investment, invest in those tables, right? Invest so that people can come to those tables, invest in their time so they have the capacity to come to those tables and really have those coordinating conversations as part of the first step on this, what we can assume will be a very long but very productive journey.
And do you think that the pandemic will permanently change people's view of how important early child care work has become or is to the general workforce, or are we going to kind of slide back? I mean, is it up to us to keep this in the front?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we have an opportunity to reimagine this early childhood industry. Not just fix an old broken system, but to move forward. And I think that, we always say early learning is good business. I mean, really, we see this as an economic driver. So there's lots of stakeholders invested in this, and we need to keep the conversation going, as I know Jermaine has some thoughts on how to do that.
Well, no, I was just going to say, it was my view from the beginning of the pandemic that we weren't going to be able to return back to work in a quote unquote normal way until we fixed our education system. And that includes early childhood education. I think this is a challenge that the underserved have likely been dealing with for some period of time. But now that this is hitting, quote unquote normal everyday people, and recognizing the importance that you need to have a foundation and a service and a resource to support their children. I think this has elevated, the conversation that we're having right now. And I think it's because of that this is likely going to be a conversation that we're going to continue. One, because we haven't seen all the outcomes that are going to occur because of the pandemic. And so I think those outcomes are likely to happen over some period of time. And it's through those outcomes that I think we're going to see a growing need to make sure that we're supporting this population going forward. So for me, I would say it's an ongoing opportunity. We've seen it as an ongoing opportunity here at PNC. It's the reason why we've invested for such a long period of time, going back to 2004. And we committed to $500 million. We're only $192 million of giving into that $500 million commitment. So we have a long way to go within it, but it will require a long-term sustained commitment to support this area, to make the improvements and to end the systemic challenges that we've had for some period of time.
I think that this industry is going to evolve, and I think every industry is going to evolve, right? And so for all of the parents who found out they might not be great teachers and who have a greater respect for the teachers, there are going to be some parents who found out that they actually are good at this. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go into the profession necessarily and go into center-based care, especially as we look at all the other industries that are going to shift and evolve, and more people are going to go to telework. I know when we were in the green room earlier, we talked about folks are looking at space and saying, why do we need to go back if we actually saw that our productivity not only was the same, but maybe increased, right? Remote, right? So I think that we're going to start to see a shift and change in the industry. And so I think, Wendy, what we need to do is keep, yes, early childhood education at the forefront, but be willing to accept that this may mean a different model, a hybrid model, something that looks just different. And I think we should all be braced and prepared for that, because, you know, and I hate when everybody's like talking about, oh, the new normal and da, da, da. But we have to understand this is a business, and business and industry shift. And this was a forcing function to start folks to think about how can we still get the desired outcomes in perhaps a different way.
You know, if I might add, I think the crux of this issue is really that this is an issue of equity. It's about equity of access for families so that they can access affordable, high quality early learning experiences for their children. And it's an equity issue for the early childhood workforce, as Marika has highlighted, you know, predominantly women and women of color who are doing such critical work for the current generation and future generations, and that needs to be valued and compensated equitably. So I think that this issue is here to stay, and it's, you know, our roles to keep that moving forward from the various perspectives that we all bring and the roles that we play. And it really takes everybody. It's going to take voices from every sector coming together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I think as we as this provides an opportunity for us to reimagine and rethink the new normal, I think who has the privilege of reimagining and who is at the table when new models and policies are being constructed is really important as well. I think the equity issue also goes to the solutions generation.
Right. So if we move ahead on this kind of thinking, how do we create pathways to that better paying early education and increase professional development and educational opportunities for early child care workers so that early childhood education becomes a career of choice? I know that Kim and Martha's Table are working hard on this issue, so maybe you want to be the first to sort of respond to that.
Yeah, we do. Here's the thing. It's extraordinarily expensive. One of the things that folks have to understand is the difference between daycare, custodial care, and early childhood education actually means you have to be credentialed. So it's already, for us, extraordinarily expensive. Classroom support has to be CDA prepared, assistant teacher, associates prepared, lead teacher, bachelor's prepared. But, you know, one of the things that is the number one thing running anything, that your investment should be in your people. Your people are your number one asset. We always say 1MT, and we have made extraordinary investments in the team. First of all, we launched our STEP program, staff training and education program, STEP. We took tuition assistance from $1,500 a year to $9,000 a year plus. We added a professional development category for $2,000 a year plus. $1,500 for a transcript unlock fund. Here's the thing, anybody knows me, my background's in workforce development. A lot of folks don't know, when you start somewhere and you haven't finished and you might owe that institution some money, you can't move forward until you get your official transcript out, or you have to start over. So we have a transcript unlock fund, the tuition assistance, and we have the professional development. We have no time in service, meaning you do not have to stay. We believe that we want to be a part of you achieving your dream, whatever it is. And nothing actually has to be linked to your actual job. We have people who are taking French. We have people who just became EMTs. It's great. It's great. Invest in people. That's not it with STEP. You know what else we've done? We give people 12 days a year, not charged against their time off, for educational days. So when you talk about equity, what is it that most people need? They need money and they need time. So when you think about our educators, our folks in food, our folks in family engagement, our folks all across the board, all 130 of our amazing team members at Martha's Table, you aren't making that much money. A statistic was given earlier about what do you make in ECE, right? Okay, well, you're not making all that much money, right? So what happens when you actually want to pursue a career? What you don't want to do in terms of upskilling is have to say, Do I choose a job or work? No, you don't have to choose. So you can actually use your work days plus your work money to actually upskill. We launched a program with Trinity Washington University and American University. It's called Petals, which is all about the CDA, AA, BA, MA stack. We Martha's Table, imagine that, negotiated the articulations between the two institutions such that if you get your AA, for example, at Trinity and you decide that you want to go to American, you're not going to lose your credits, and worked with American to bring their tuition costs down so that cost wouldn't necessarily be a barrier. Putting in place systems and structures, though expensive, it's the right thing to do. And again, it's about equity. What else did we do? We launched a compensation study, and we had a philosophy behind that said, we will start with market, but we don't believe that the market actually values people and their roles the way that we do. So the market came back, not surprisingly, ECE came back, awful. You know what we've done? We're now paying market plus for every position that we have deemed that is not valued in the market. And again, being in early childhood education and food, that's a lot of our positions. And so we've jumped all of those salaries up significantly, statistically significantly. So we're paying market plus. Are we paying $1 bazillion? No. But if you're out there on the market and you want to be in a place where you're going to get more than market value for early childhood education, and you have the opportunity to increase in your career, well, you know where you want to go? You want to go to Martha's Table. Martha's Table for the win. Yeah.
Yeah, and our role should be to normalize that, right? That, you know, that should be the norm. And so how do we make that model where educators are respected for the professionals that they are? They have an environment that supports their well-being. They have access to a clearly delineated career pathway that's affordable and accessible. And so, like, how do we normalize that is the question that we should be asking ourselves, so that it's not a luxury and you don't have to blend 20 plus funding streams to get there.
Right. As someone, Anne-Marie or Jermaine, do you have something to add to Kim's enthusiasm? But could that be a model or build on those ideas beyond, right, the 130 people that work at Martha's Table? Not to denigrate that, because that is an amazing model that we could be thinking about in a broader sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard a lot about credentials and helping these educators and care providers get the credentials they need so they can elevate, you know, the equity in terms of the income that they earn. That's been a focus here at PNC. We've done that with a couple grants that we provided over the years, in addition to what we do, you know, through the Educator centers that we support, supporting individuals, I think, and elevating their opportunity to get the credentials they need to get the equity that they deserve, you know, for the service they provide. It's a real, I think, a quicker way potentially to get at some of these challenges. Because as Kim mentioned, it's an expensive proposition to support this, right? That this is not, it's going to require the public, private, you know, any other funding resource that we can bring to this. We're going to need it. But a quick way to get after some of that is to go after the individuals who have been in this business, have been in this segment for years, and to help them elevate the credentials they need to get the income that they deserve.
Can I also just add really quickly that as we talk about professionalizing this area, it's amazing when you even talk to early childhood educators and helping them realize you're a professional, you don't watch kids. And watching that sense of self-worth and value in themselves and their profession, and knowing that they're a real qualified, credentialed teacher that's imparting knowledge, like that's also, I think, an important nut that we need to crack and make sure that is happening across the industry, because the more that you see that value, the more you're going to see the family value, the more you're going to see the system value.
And I think that value is particularly important. I think I heard someone comment about, we're not talking about daycare providers, okay? Like, and I think we too often think of that early childhood space as a babysitter, but the social resources that are provided during these very critical years, the educational resources that are provided during these early education years, that's the value proposition that I think that we've learned here in the pandemic that I'm not sure that anyone would have really recognized without having the critical situation we've been dealing with for the last 15 months.
And Anne Marie, I think that you might have some insight here about what is happening in Virginia.
Sure. At a local level, we have been working to really build a pathway so that we're meeting educators where they are. And that includes offering at no cost professional learning opportunities so that people can take courses and classes. We have some through our county's Institute for Early Learning that then articulate to Northern Virginia Community College. So someone can gain some confidence, then move on to NVCC. They have access to state scholarship and hopefully could get a certificate or an AA degree. Virginia's made great strides in these past 3 years and now have community college articulation with 4-year universities so that people can then move on to the next step and get a bachelor's in education, which is very exciting. We also recognize that there are other educators who will not take that pathway, that turn on the pathway, but may like to earn their child development associate credential. We're partnering with Fairfax Futures, a local nonprofit that focuses on school readiness and supporting early childhood workforce. And they have a generous grant from the Wyatt Foundation to bring forward a CDA mentoring program that we're doing in partnership with them. So working with a cohort of educators from center-based programs and family childcare homes so that they'll get coaching and mentoring and the professional learning that they need in order to obtain their CDA credentials. So it takes different opportunities like that. That model we're doing in both English and Spanish. So we're making sure that this is easily accessible to educators at no cost. And then, of course, the next step is linking those competencies to some type of compensation, as Kim so enthusiastically shared. In Virginia, Fairfax County is one of 10 PDG communities, preschool development grants communities, and Virginia is dedicating almost half of their federal grant to financial incentives for educators. So we're excited to be part of that. And that's one way that there's direct cash payments made to educators who are part of the program and meeting these standards. And that's really been demonstrating a big difference in the retention rates and decreased turnover rates. The PDG evaluation team from the University of Virginia had done a study on that. So there's information that we can use to advocate and articulate how supporting the professional learning of our early childhood workforce does work. There are measurable outcomes. It impacts the quality of care, and that when we link that to compensation, we're able to retain people in the workforce, which is our ultimate goal. So I think we've got some pathways. There's a lot more work to do, but we really have the information and the data that we need to make the case.
I just want to real quick emphasize before we move on to the next thing that everything we've been hearing from the panelists today and everything that many of us deal with daily, there's oftentimes conversations around advancing the workforce and getting, the maintenance or, the advancement in credentials. And then there's separate conversations around compensation. And what I think we're hearing from this panel and what our work at the Women's Foundation has shown is that you cannot separate those two conversations. Kim talked about, educators to understand their own value. Like, that's great that Martha Tables does that, but how sad is it that as a society, we have given these mostly women of color, immigrant women, the message that they're not valued, right? And how sad is it that we entrust them to care for our most precious asset and educate our most precious asset. And yet we have given them these messages that have clearly been internalized, that they need to operate within a scarcity environment, that they don't deserve to earn these wages, that they don't deserve to have benefits, that they don't deserve to take advantage of higher education opportunities. And so I'm stepping on a soapbox for a second, just because I really want to emphasize that everything that we've said each panelist has said is about really marrying those two. We cannot separate them. And that's why, when I talk about stronger public investment, that's really what I'm talking about, is that, the market doesn't allow in the current system for, we're not buying widgets, right? Like, it's not a supply and demand type of a thing here with early education. So we really need to figure out how we can secure the public investments that are necessary to allow for high quality, affordability for families, and appropriate compensation for those educators. And, Wendy, you and I have talked about this previously. We've all, many of us have talked offline about this previously. We subsidize things we value in this country. And if early education is something that we value, part of an integral part of our economy, it needs to be subsidized by the government to that end, in the same way that we subsidize corn, not to minimize corn, but, if we care about corn, I think we should care about kids.
Kim, is that you cheering, or that you have something to say here?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm at work. People were waving. I was waving.
God.
But yes, I'm cheering. Yes, cheering. I thought Martine's comments were right. Yes.
Well, I totally agree. But even the change of language, right? I mean, if we refer to early childhood educators, right, we are starting to give them some different respect than when we call them babysitters or workers or any other sort of word that we've been using all this time. It's like we've changed the words climate change, right? Because we want to give it a different perspective. That these people who take care, as Martine said, of our children, who we should value the most, we pay the least and we give the least respect. And that, I think, leads to the other things that you all have been talking about, in terms of how we increase the pay, which is part of the whole problem. So again, thank you. I don't know if we have time for one more question, but it goes back to something that VPP really has been trying to do for the last 20 years. But how do we build those bridges between the stakeholders across the jurisdictions to address this workforce development around early childhood? Do we have sort of models out there that we could be looking at? I'll ask Martine if since she has always a broader perspective with Marika.
Yeah, I mean, well, anybody can really answer this, but there, from my perspective, there's good work happening on the ground. And I think that there are different stakeholders engaged in various pieces of that work. And I think it's a matter of us really working hard to enter those spaces, right? So if we're outside those spaces, how can we enter those spaces? There's some good examples of advocacy coalitions in DC in particular. The Under 3 DC Coalition has some really diverse players involved in that coalition. There's a coalition in Montgomery County called Montgomery Moving Forward that's looking at early education workforce. And they've engaged the business community in Montgomery County fairly well as well, to your point about cross-sector engagement. There is a early educator coalition, advocacy coalition in Prince George's County called Joining Voices, that's out of the Prince George's Child Resource Center. And this is just to name a few. There's an early ed policy group led by Voices for Virginia's Children in Northern Virginia. which others are very engaged in. And, and then there's, folks like me who are, trying to figure out how we can get funding so that all of these groups can come together and work with each other. And so that work is happening as well, sort of behind the scenes, alongside NACCE, with getting the local NACCE affiliates the support they need to work together as a regional approach. So local affiliates in many of our jurisdictions, early educators themselves, membership organizations, and how can they really sort of drive these conversations, but in partnership with other cross-sector folks. And I think that, for some of us, it's just a matter of knowing what's already there and then sort of engaging with them directly. And so I'll offer that if anybody in the audience has questions about how they can get involved with a particular group or from a particular perspective, I'm happy to make those connections as part of the Women's Foundation's work.
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead. No, I was just going to say, so we have a bunch of experts here on the panel. I'm the least experienced in this space, but what I would say is, from my perspective, the stakeholder is different depending on who you're talking to. And in our case, the stakeholder is really the employees and the workforce. I think Kim talked about it earlier. And to me, the change that we've just gone through is that the employee ultimately drives what are the important topics that we deal with here in our country. And I'm sitting here in our Washington, D.C. office, and there's no one else here except for me. And yesterday, our CEO decided that we're not going to come back into our office until sometime in November. And even then, we're going to be very flexible. And I think the pandemic here, as it relates to early childhood education, is that we just, our employees understand how important this issue is. And to get the public support, the public policy and investment that's needed, the pandemic has driven a hole through the resources that we ultimately need to bolster this issue. So I think that's the most important stakeholder from my perspective, and I think that's what's going to drive the change we're looking for going forward.
Well, thank you. I'm getting the little sign here. So I'm so sad that we've run out of time, and obviously we could and probably should spend a lot more time talking about this early childhood workforce and the ideas for the cross collaboration and this regional approach. I wish we all and everyone who's listening would become stronger and louder advocates for children in our country. As Martine said, they're our most precious asset. They are our future. They are our leaders and thinkers. And we need to support the people who support them. End of soapbox. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. The panel has spent a lot of time thinking about this and working in this space, and will continue to do so. And we should all thank them for doing this important work. And I guess I'm going to turn this over to Sarah Dover at VPP to close us out. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you to our panelists for that timely and vital conversation. Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Slobodin-Dover, Vice President of External Affairs at VPP+Raise DC. We are fortunate to have the corporate, funding collaborative, nonprofit, foundation, and government perspectives represented on today's panel. While disparities in the early childhood workforce development field have only been exacerbated by the pandemic, it is inspiring to note that our region is working tirelessly to develop solutions to support our early childhood educators better. As with all VPP+Raise DC investments, this cross-sector collaboration is precisely what is needed to affect long-term systems change. Our past investments in early childcare providers like Mary Center, Centronia, and Appletree demonstrate our keen understanding of the role that early childhood education plays in creating positive outcomes for vulnerable children. In fact, we are bringing together a regional cross-sector table to look at the data and determine opportunities for impact, in addition to exploring ways to pilot a new model for early childhood education providers. Before we conclude, I also want to take a moment to thank you, our audience, including our dedicated investors, for your continued support of VPP+Raise DC. And to those of you who may have only recently discovered our work, I encourage you to learn more at vppartners.org and follow us across social media to stay up to date on our news and events. On behalf of our team, thank you for joining us. We look forward to announcing the next program in our bi-monthly 20th anniversary speaker series soon.